Let's talk about the lever of coalitions or networks. So what are they? They're an interconnected system or structure of separate groups who have come together toward one common goal. And there's a lot of new theory about networks in the social sector space that suggests that networks may create greater social change faster and more long-lasting than one organization working alone. What's critical about coalitions or networks is that they require a different kind of leadership. So if you're thinking about this as a lever, it's important to understand that more communication is needed across and among these organizations. There needs to be a lot of sensitivity to culture and working well with others and negotiating fairly and working well with peers, not in a hierarchical manner, and a lot of patience and a lot of attention to complexity. But it's very, very promising and has been shown to be very effective in the past. So an example I mentioned was the US Civil Rights Movement, and it's so compelling that I'd like to explain it again. So this was a time in the United States when there was segregation and discrimination, and it was legal. And a number of different organizations, national organizations, were coming together to try to do something about this, change the laws. So the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But one of their questions was, where do they do this? Where can they create this change? And they focused on the South, because this is where segregation was the worst in the country at that time. And they had to pair with local leaders. Now, there were a number of pastors who then became famous, Martin Luther King being obviously one of them, who were preaching in local churches and were forming local groups to create large-scale change. And one of the questions was, what do we do? Okay, what kind of change are we looking for? What's the action we're looking for? Well, one that was selected there, one was eating at lunch counters and trying to integrate lunch counters. Others were integrating schools, but one that I want to focus on is the bus system, because the bus system was segregated. Whites and blacks could both ride the bus, but blacks had to be at the back of the bus, and if there were rows in between, blacks could sit there, but if a white person got on the bus, they had to go to the back. So this was a situation, and as the organizations were looking at what action can they take, they started to focus on this inequity in public transportation. And a lot of the black members of the community had to use the bus to get to work or to get to visit family, etc. What they did was they waited for the right opportunity and the right person who was being asked to move to the back of the bus, who we now know was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was not just anyone. She was a member, she was the secretary of the local NAACP. Okay? So the coalition of organizations was important here. She was asked to move off the bus, she refused. Let me go to the end of the story. Blacks in the South stayed off the buses for 381 days. They walked, they created their own taxi system through rain, through heat, through all kinds of weather, 381 days to stop those buses from going. How did they do that? The missing middle between these large organizations and the action that happened was local black churches, where the decision was made at the end of 1 week to stop using the buses, boycott them on Monday. What happened that weekend was the organizations asked the pastors, local pastors in black churches, to please preach about the importance of staying off the buses. On Friday, the organizations didn't even know if people would participate. There was real concern. But by Monday, it was 90% participation. That's the power of the network or the coalition. So what are the advantages? The advantages of you can bring more resources and complementary strengths. You're not limited by your own organization or the resources only you have. There's a quicker startup and momentum, for instance, than grassroots, because you have all these different organizations with their members and with their outreach, so it can happen very quickly. Often a movement goes to stability earlier because you've got these organizations that know how to work, know how to get things done. There's staying power, there's continuity, and there's shared leadership, which is important if you think about the US civil rights movement. It did not stop when Martin Luther King was killed. Leaders are vulnerable in social movements. There's also a richness of ideas from multiple organizations that you just can't get from one. So those are some of the advantages of the network of organizations trying to create social change, large-scale social change. What are the drawbacks? You can have differences among organizations. So you've got to negotiate values and cultures and how you work together and who plays the leadership roles. And those can be difficult, which is why leadership is a little different when you're leading organizations within a coalition. Coordination is time consuming. It takes more time and it can get more difficult. On the other hand, we're starting to see that it can be more effective. And finally, it's harder to hold together a coalition than it is one organization. So those are some of the downsides or the drawbacks. The advantages, however, are pretty strong, and we saw them historically in US civil rights. We also saw them in the first Women's March in the US, where it was a number of different organizations, Planned Parenthood and others, that got millions of women out to march.